When I came back from fishing, I found all my stuff thrown in the trash. My son's wife looked at me and said, "We do not need you anymore. Go live at the dump." I smiled, picked up my phone, and made a single call. 3 days later, they were desperately looking for me all over the country, because what they did not know was that they had just handed me the key to destroy their entire world. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I thought I knew exactly who my family was. I was wrong. The realization did not come with a warning. It came in the form of 6 heavy black plastic trash bags sitting on the pristine front lawn of the $2.5 million Bellevue estate. The very same estate I had bought and paid for with my own money. I pulled my truck into the driveway, putting the vehicle in park. The engine ticked quietly in the afternoon heat. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, just staring through the windshield. At first I thought they were doing some aggressive spring cleaning, but then my eyes caught a glint of brass tearing through the thin plastic of the third bag. I stepped out of the truck. My knees were a little stiff from sitting in the fishing boat all morning, but my mind was entirely sharp. I walked over to the manicured grass. I reached down and pulled the torn plastic wider. Inside, tangled in a mess of my everyday shirts and trousers, were my antique engineering drafting tools. The heavy brass compasses and calipers I had used for 40 years to design bridges and high-rises. They were just tossed in there like scrap metal. I felt a tightening in my chest, but I pushed it down. I moved to the next bag. It was partially untied. Poking out of the top was a faded patch of red and blue fabric. I pulled it out. It was the handmade quilt my wife Martha had stitched together during her final months. She had spent hours in her armchair, her hands trembling from the pancreatic cancer treatments, sewing every square so I would have something to keep me warm when she was gone. 4 years since her passing, and this quilt was my most prized possession. And now it was sitting in the dirt. I heard the heavy oak front door swing open. I slowly stood up, holding Martha's quilt against my side. Brittany, my 32-year-old daughter-in-law, stood on the porch. She was wearing expensive yoga pants and holding an iced coffee. Her posture was rigid, her chin tilted up in that familiar, arrogant way she always assumed when she felt she was in control. She did not look guilty. She looked triumphant. Before I could say a word, she reached behind the doorframe, picked up my last leather duffel bag, and casually tossed it down the porch steps. It hit the concrete walkway with a dull, heavy thud. "We do not need a clueless old man in the way anymore, Harrison," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "You are a burden. Go live at the dump." The words hung in the quiet suburban air. I did not yell. I did not ask her what she thought she was doing. My eyes drifted past her, moving to the large floor-to-ceiling windows next to the front door. Standing in the foyer, half hidden by the expensive silk drapes I had paid for, was Derek. My son. My 35-year-old boy, the CEO of his own tech startup, the man I had sacrificed my retirement to support. Derek stood there perfectly still. When my eyes met his through the glass, he flinched. He literally cowered, turning his head away and stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. He could not even look his own father in the eye while his wife threw me out like garbage. In that fraction of a second, the last remaining shred of paternal weakness inside me completely evaporated. 30 years of raising him, providing for him, making sure he never knew the struggles I faced, all of it vanished. I realized I was not looking at family anymore. I was looking at parasites. "Are you deaf?" Brittany snapped, taking a step forward. I said, "Get off our property. Do not come back. We are done playing nursemaid to a confused old man." I looked down at the quilt in my hands, brushing a piece of dry grass off the fabric. Then I looked back up at her. I did not scream. I did not beg for a place to stay. I simply smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, calculated smile of an engineer who has just spotted a fatal structural flaw in a building that is about to collapse. "You are absolutely right, Brittany," I said softly. My voice was completely steady. "I will be out of your hair." Her smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. She had expected a fight. She had expected me to plead, to cry, to break down and ask where I was supposed to go. Manipulators always expect a performance so they can play the victim later. Giving her nothing but absolute calm terrified her. I reached into the pocket of my fishing jacket and pulled out my cell phone. I kept my eyes locked on hers as I dialed the number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. "Thomas," I said. Thomas Reynolds was my attorney, a man who built his reputation tearing apart corporate fraudsters in federal court. "He had warned me about this exact moment," Harrison Thomas said. "Tell me you are okay." "I am perfectly fine," I replied, watching the slight confusion creep into Brittany's eyes. "Pull the breaker, Thomas. Initiate the Alpha protocol." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low, almost satisfied sigh. "Consider it done, Harrison. Give me 24 hours. I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I looked at Brittany one last time. She was gripping her iced coffee tightly, trying to maintain her arrogant posture, but the uncertainty was starting to crack her foundation. She had no idea what the Alpha protocol was. She had no idea that by kicking me out, she had just triggered a financial avalanche that would completely obliterate her extravagant lifestyle. "Enjoy the house," I told her quietly. "While you can." I turned my back on her. I did not bother packing the heavy trash bags into my truck. The clothes could be replaced. The antique tools could be bought again. The only thing I needed was Martha's quilt, which was tucked safely under my arm. I opened the door of my truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I put the truck in reverse, I glanced at the rearview mirror. Brittany was still standing on the porch, watching me back out of the driveway. Derek had finally crept out to stand behind her, a look of profound cowardice etched across his face. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally discarded the final obstacle to their perfect, unearned wealth. I shifted into drive and pulled out onto the quiet street, leaving my $2.5 million property behind without a single ounce of regret. They wanted me to be a helpless, confused old man with no memory and no power. I was going to let them believe that illusion for exactly 3 more days. Because when the hammer finally fell, I wanted them to feel the full crushing weight of their own arrogance. As I drove away from Bellevue, my mind began to replay the events of the last 8 months. How had a rational, calculating structural engineer allowed himself to be treated this way? How had I let my own son maneuver me into a corner? The truth was, it did not happen overnight. It was a slow, methodical poison. And the first dose was administered right after I had a minor health scare. They thought I was weak. But weakness is a matter of perspective, and I was about to change theirs entirely. The tires of my truck hummed against the smooth asphalt of the Bellevue suburban roads. I rolled down the window, letting the crisp Washington breeze hit my face. It felt good. It felt like waking up from a long, suffocating sleep. The neighborhood was a parade of manicured lawns, pristine gates, and quiet wealth. I had paid for my piece of that world, with 40 years of sweat drafting blueprints until my eyes blurred, calculating support walls, and ensuring that foundations were poured perfectly. I knew how to build things that lasted. My son, on the other hand, only knew how to exploit the things other people built. I reached the main intersection that led out to the highway. The traffic light shifted from yellow to red, and I brought the truck to a gentle stop. The cab was silent, completely isolated from the chaos I had just left behind on my front porch. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My thumb hovered over the screen, swiping away a few mundane notifications before I opened my secure banking application. I needed to verify the first phase of the Alpha protocol. I logged in and stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. The accounts tied to the Bellevue estate were officially locked. The structural integrity of Derek and Brittany's financial facade had just been compromised. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat as the light turned green, pressing my foot onto the accelerator. As the scenery shifted from quiet suburbs to the open stretch of the interstate, my thoughts drifted back to a hospital room 8 months ago. That was where this entire miserable chapter had begun. I had suffered a minor transient ischemic attack, a warning sign from my body that I needed to slow down. It was terrifying in the moment, a sudden numbness in my left arm, and a brief slurring of my words while I was pouring my morning coffee. But the doctors caught it quickly. They assured me there was no permanent damage, just a need for medication and lifestyle adjustments. Derek and Brittany, however, saw an opportunity. They rushed into my recovery room like actors stepping onto a stage. Brittany was clutching a tissue, squeezing out fake tears, while Derek held my hand with a grip that felt more like a restraint than a gesture of comfort. They begged me not to return to my quiet, empty house. They told me it was too dangerous for me to live alone. "Dad, you could fall," Derek had said, his voice trembling with manufactured panic. "We want you with us. We want to care for you. Let us take care of you the way you took care of me." It sounded so perfect. It sounded exactly like the filial piety any father would hope for in his twilight years. So I agreed. I packed up my life and moved into the sprawling Bellevue estate. The bitter irony, of course, was that they were inviting me into a house that my money had purchased. $2.5 million wired directly from my accounts to secure their dream home, with the promise that I would always have a sanctuary there. The reality of my new living situation became apparent within the first few weeks. Their definition of caring for me was actually a systematic method of stripping away my independence. It started with small, seemingly helpful gestures. Brittany insisted on organizing my weekly pill dispensers. Then she suggested that she should hold on to my car keys because my reaction times might not be safe for the road. I allowed it initially, trusting the process, believing that my son and his wife genuinely had my best interests at heart. But the house quickly transformed from a sanctuary into a velvet-lined prison. I was relegated to the guest room on the ground floor, far away from their daily activities. They managed my schedule. They intercepted my mail. They curated who I could speak to and when I could leave the property. I was an engineer. My brain was trained to analyze patterns, to detect stress fractures in concrete and steel. It did not take long for me to see the stress fractures in their behavior. When I asked questions about my accounts or my mail, their tones would shift from sweet to condescending. They treated me like a child, subtly reinforcing the narrative that I was frail, confused, and incapable of managing my own affairs. I realized that my presence in the house was not about family. It was about control. They needed me under their roof to monitor me, to ensure I did not notice the quiet maneuvering happening in the background. I merged onto the fast lane of the highway, the speedometer climbing steadily. The sky above the interstate was a pale, clear blue, completely devoid of clouds. It mirrored the newfound clarity in my own mind. I watched the highway signs blur past me, each one marking a greater distance between myself and the toxic environment I had just escaped. The irony of this afternoon was profoundly satisfying. Derek and Brittany were completely blinded by their own greed and arrogance. By throwing my belongings into trash bags and ordering me out, they thought they were getting rid of a burden. They thought they had finally eliminated the last watchful eye in their house, leaving them free to enjoy the wealth they had siphoned from my life. But they fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of leverage. By forcibly removing me from the premises, they had voluntarily surrendered their physical custody over me. They had severed the very chains they had spent 8 months carefully forging. As long as I was living under their roof, they could intercept my mail monitor, my phone calls, and paint a picture to the outside world of a senile old man who needed constant supervision. They could control the narrative. Now I was out in the open, completely autonomous with my phone, my truck, and my perfectly sound mind. They had kicked out the hostage entirely unaware that the hostage was holding the detonator. I glanced at the phone resting on the passenger seat. The screen was dark, but I knew the gears of the Alpha protocol were already turning at my lawyer's office. Legal notices were being generated. Bank freezes were being authorized. The blind trust was not a simple legal maneuver. It was an impenetrable fortress designed to detect and neutralize fraudulent claims against my assets. Thomas was meticulous, and I knew his team was currently locking down every financial artery Derek thought he controlled. The sheer stupidity of their actions was almost comical. They had practically handed me the key to their destruction. The dominoes were not just falling. They were accelerating, crashing into one another with absolute precision. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. For the first time in nearly a year, I was not playing a role. I was not the frail father. I was Harrison Caldwell, and I was going to teach my son a lesson about structural collapse. The hum of the highway tires became a steady rhythm, pulling my thoughts back. To understand the magnitude of what I was about to unleash upon Derek and Brittany, you have to understand how masterfully they laid their foundation of deceit. It did not happen at once. It was an insidious, creeping takeover of my autonomy disguised entirely as familial love and concern. The first real warning sign was not a missing bank statement or a forged document. It was a simple set of keys. I had driven the same reliable truck for 6 years. I knew every sound its engine made, every nuance of its steering. Driving was my independence. But about 2 months after I moved into the Bellevue house, my keys vanished. I had left them in the ceramic bowl by the front door, right where I always placed them after a morning trip to the hardware store. The next day, when I wanted to drive out to the lake to inspect a new fishing rod, the bowl was empty. I spent an hour searching the house, checking the pockets of my jackets, looking under the sofa cushions. When I finally asked Brittany if she had seen them, she gave me a look of deep, sorrowful pity. She gently placed her hand on my shoulder and told me I had lost them days ago. She claimed I had come home frustrated, saying I could not remember where I parked at the grocery store and that Derek had to drive over and find the truck for me. None of that had happened. My memory of driving home, of parking in the driveway, of tossing the keys into the bowl, was perfectly clear. But she spoke with such gentle, unwavering conviction that for a terrifying moment I actually doubted my own mind. I asked her to help me look for the spare set. She shook her head, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, and said Derek had locked the spares in his safe because the doctor warned them about my reaction times. She told me I was a danger on the road. Just like that, my mobility was severed. I was effectively grounded, confined to the perimeter of their property. The loss of my truck was only the beginning of the structural dismantling of my life. The next phase was physical. After my minor stroke, I was prescribed a standard regimen of blood thinners and mild cholesterol medication. I had managed my own prescriptions for decades without a single error. But soon after the key incident, Brittany took it upon herself to manage my health. She bought a massive pill organizer and placed it on the kitchen counter. She insisted it was her duty as a loving daughter-in-law to ensure I never missed a dose. I did not want to cause friction, so I allowed it. That was a critical mistake. Within a week of her taking over my medication, a thick, heavy fog rolled into my brain. I started waking up exhausted. I would sit in the armchair in the guest room to read a book and end up sleeping for 4 hours in the middle of the afternoon. My limbs felt like they were made of lead. The sharp, analytical mind that had spent a lifetime calculating load-bearing limits and tensile strength was suddenly struggling to follow the plot of a simple television show. I felt sluggish, disconnected from reality, floating in a constant state of mild sedation. When I mentioned the extreme fatigue to Brittany, her performance was flawless. She poured me a glass of water, handed me another small white pill from her organizer, and told me that my body was just healing. She said the doctor had adjusted my dosages to keep my blood pressure perfectly stable, and that the lethargy was a normal side effect of recovery. She would smooth my collar, smile sweetly, and tell me to go rest. I trusted her because I wanted to believe my family was protecting me. I swallowed the pills she handed me, washing them down with water, completely unaware that I was voluntarily consuming the very chemicals designed to keep me docile and compliant. They needed me foggy. They needed me sleeping through the day so they could maneuver in the shadows. The fog made it incredibly difficult to focus on details, but my subconscious was still an engineer. It still looked for anomalies. The anomaly that finally broke through the chemical haze was the mail. For 40 years, I had received thick envelopes containing my monthly portfolio reports, bank statements, and tax documents. I liked holding the paper, reviewing the numbers, and filing them away in my physical ledger. But as the weeks turned into months in the Bellevue house, my mail stopped arriving. At first, I assumed it was a postal delay. Then I realized my name was entirely absent from the stack of mail Derek brought in from the mailbox every evening. When I managed to summon the energy to check the physical mailbox myself, it was always empty. Derek had secretly redirected all my financial correspondence to a private post office box. I was completely isolated from my own wealth. I did not know my account balances. I did not know what investments were maturing. I was living in an expensive house that I bought, sleeping on a mattress I paid for, eating food purchased with my money. Yet I was treated like a charity case who had no right to inquire about the household finances. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday evening. I had deliberately skipped my morning and afternoon doses of whatever Brittany was feeding me, hiding the pills in my pocket and flushing them down the toilet later. My head throbbed with a withdrawal headache, but the thick mental fog was beginning to thin. I walked into the living room where Derek was sitting on the leather sofa scrolling through his tablet. I stood over him, demanding to know why I had not seen a bank statement in 3 months. I asked him directly where my mail was going. Derek slowly set his tablet down. He stood up, closing the distance between us. He did not look angry or defensive. Instead, his face arranged itself into an expression of profound, pitying sorrow. He reached out and took my hand, holding it affectionately between both of his. "Dad," he said, his voice soft and soothing. "Your memory is really slipping. We talked about this weeks ago. Do you not remember?" I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Remember what I asked?" He squeezed my hand gently. "You signed a power of attorney over to me, Dad. You said the numbers were becoming too confusing. You said you just wanted to relax and let me handle the stress. The doctor said you need rest to prevent another stroke. I am doing what you asked me to do. I am taking care of you." I stared into my son's eyes as he spoke those words, feeling the floor drop out from beneath my feet. He was lying to my face with the practiced ease of a seasoned con artist. I had never signed a power of attorney. I had never told him the numbers were confusing, and my doctor had never advised me to surrender my financial autonomy. But in that chilling moment, I realized that arguing with him would only tip my hand. If I fought back, if I demanded to see the imaginary paperwork, he would know the chemical fog was lifting. He would simply change his tactics, perhaps escalate the dosage, or find another way to neutralize me completely. I looked down at my weathered hands, forcing my shoulders to slump, adopting the posture of a defeated old man. I offered a slow nod, whispering a quiet apology for my confusion, and shuffled back to my room. I was a target living with a predator. The depth of their cruelty became undeniably clear during a lavish dinner party they hosted 1 month ago. Brittany loved to entertain. She used the house I purchased to project an image of immense wealth and sophisticated social standing to her circle of friends. On that Friday evening, the estate was filled with the sound of clinking crystal glasses, a hired jazz quartet playing in the grand living room, and the loud conversations of the local elite. I had been instructed, very sweetly but firmly, to remain in my guest room so the noise would not disturb my rest. But my mind was agonizingly sharp that night. I had been spitting out the sedatives for weeks, flushing them down the drain, while feigning a lethargic slumber whenever Brittany checked on me. Around 9 o'clock, the jazz band took a break, and the chatter in the house settled into a steady hum. My throat was dry, so I quietly opened my bedroom door and padded down the long hallway toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. I moved slowly, leaning heavily on the wall, maintaining the disguise of physical frailty just in case someone saw me. As I neared the massive marble kitchen island, I heard Brittany's voice ringing out over the ambient noise. She was holding court with a group of her wealthy friends, a glass of expensive champagne balanced in her hand. I stopped in the shadows of the pantry corridor, out of their sight, and listened. "It is just so utterly exhausting, honestly," Brittany was saying, her tone dripping with dramatic martyrdom. "You have no idea the toll it takes on a marriage to become a full-time caregiver in your 30s. One of her friends murmured a sympathetic response, asking how my health was faring. Brittany let out a long, theatrical sigh. "His dementia is progressing incredibly fast. It is like having an oversized toddler in the house. He forgets where he puts his keys, he cannot remember his bank details, and half the time he just stares blankly at the wall. Derek and I are doing everything we can to manage his life because he is incapable of doing it himself. I am practically a saint for putting up with the constant confusion." I stood frozen in this dark corridor, my fingernails digging into my palms. My recent medical examinations had been pristine. My cognitive function was perfectly intact, and Brittany knew that. She was intentionally fabricating a narrative of severe mental decline and broadcasting it to the local social circle. She was planting seeds establishing a public record of my supposed incompetence. If anyone questioned my financial decisions or if I tried to claim I was being mistreated, her friends would shake their heads and say the poor old engineer had lost his mind. It was a brilliant, malicious strategy. It took every ounce of discipline I cultivated over my 70 years to stay hidden in the shadows and not march into that kitchen to expose her lies. But an engineer knows you never apply stress to a compromised wall until you are ready to bring the entire building down. I turned away from the kitchen, leaving my thirst unquenched, and began the slow, quiet walk back to my room. To get there, I had to pass Derek's private study. The heavy oak doors to his office were usually locked tight during these social gatherings, but tonight one of the doors was left cracked open a fraction of an inch. A sliver of warm yellow light spilled onto the hallway floor. As I shuffled past, I heard the hushed, urgent murmur of my son's voice. I paused, pressing my back flat against the wall outside the study, and peered through the narrow gap. Derek was not socializing with his guests. He was standing behind his mahogany desk, facing a man who looked entirely out of place in our elegant home. The stranger was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit, and sweat glistened on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He nervously clutched a battered leather briefcase. I recognized him from a brief encounter weeks prior. He was a commercial bank appraiser. Derek reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. The shape and density of the paper suggested it was packed with tightly banded stacks of $100 bills. Derek slid the heavy envelope across the polished wood surface. The appraiser glanced nervously at the door, missing my hidden presence in the dark hallway, and quickly swept the envelope into his briefcase. "Just make absolutely certain the property valuation clears the upper underwriting threshold by tomorrow morning," Derek whispered harshly, leaning across the desk. "I do not care how you have to manipulate the comparable market sales in the neighborhood. The equity numbers need to look flawless for the loan committee. If this final round of funding gets delayed by even 48 hours, the investors will pull the plug on my entire company." The appraiser nodded rapidly, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Do not worry about a thing, Derek. The valuation will be exactly what you need it to be. The paperwork will reflect maximum equity." The final pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with absolute and terrifying clarity. The missing truck keys, the heavy daily sedation, the deliberately intercepted financial mail, the carefully fabricated narrative of severe dementia, and now a bribed bank appraiser falsifying the property equity. They were not just casually stealing from my savings accounts. They were actively staging a massive, desperate financial crime, using my entire portfolio of assets as collateral. Derek was illegally leveraging the estate to save his failing tech company, and he absolutely needed me legally classified as a vegetable so I could not report the fraud to the authorities. If I confronted him tonight, he would easily destroy the evidence and find a way to silence me permanently. I had to become the exact ghost they wanted me to be. I shuffled silently back to my room, slipping into my bed and smiling into the cold darkness. The clueless old man was finally going to work. I pulled into the valet circle of the downtown hotel. The attendant opened my door with a respectful nod, a contrast to the disdain I had just endured on my porch. I handed him the keys, grabbed my leather duffel and the quilt, and walked into the grand lobby. The air smelled of fresh lilies and polished brass. I booked their best corner suite, paying with a credit card Derek did not know existed. When I finally stepped into the quiet luxury of the room overlooking the city skyline, I dropped my bags on the plush carpet. I walked over to the minibar, poured myself a neat glass of scotch, and sank into a heavy armchair. The silence of the hotel room was absolute, a profound relief after months of carefully orchestrated psychological warfare. Sitting there watching the city lights flicker, my mind traced the exact sequence of events that brought me to this moment of liberation. The true turning point had not happened today on the lawn. It had happened 2 weeks ago, in the dead of night, when I finally decided to dismantle the chemical prison they had built around my mind. After witnessing Derek bribe the bank appraiser during that dinner party, I knew my survival depended on regaining my cognitive clarity. The next morning, when Brittany approached me with her condescending smile and her plastic pill organizer, I was ready. She handed me a small paper cup of water and a handful of tablets. I placed them in my mouth, took a sip of water, and swallowed. But I did not swallow the pills. I had pushed them deep into the space beneath my tongue, pressing them hard against my lower gums. I offered Brittany a vacant, compliant smile. She patted my cheek, satisfied that I was sufficiently medicated, and walked away to continue her morning routine. The moment she turned the corner, I spat the dissolving capsules into a napkin, wrapped it tightly, and buried it in the bottom of the bathroom trash can. I repeated this performance every morning and evening. The first 3 days were agony. My body reacted violently to the sudden withdrawal of whatever heavy sedatives she had been feeding me. I suffered through blinding headaches, cold sweats, and waves of nausea that made my hands shake. I had to force myself to stay perfectly still in my guest room, gripping the armrests of my chair, pretending to be asleep whenever Derek or Brittany checked on me. But by the 4th day, the suffocating fog began to burn away. The lethargy evaporated. Colors looked brighter. Sounds became sharper. The analytical engine of my mind, dormant for months, roared back to life. I was no longer a confused patient. I was a structural engineer mapping out the vulnerabilities of an enemy fortress. With my mind clear, I spent the week quietly observing Derek. I studied his routines with the precision of a surveyor examining a load-bearing foundation. I noted exactly what time he locked himself in his study, when he took his phone calls, and most importantly, where he kept his documents. He was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He never left any sensitive paperwork in plain sight. Every night before heading upstairs to bed with Brittany, he would spend 20 minutes alone in his office. I knew the answers I needed were hidden in that room. I just had to wait for the perfect opportunity. That opportunity arrived on a Tuesday night. A heavy rainstorm was rolling off the Pacific, battering the windows of the estate and masking any internal noises. Derek and Brittany had consumed a full bottle of heavy red wine with dinner and retired to the master suite early. I lay in my bed fully dressed under the covers, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. I waited until the digital clock on my nightstand read 2 in the morning. The house was completely silent, save for the storm outside. I threw off the covers and stood up. I did not turn on any lights. I had memorized the exact layout of the house, noting which floorboards creaked and which hinges squeaked. I slipped out of my room and moved down the dark hallway with the silent steps of a ghost. I reached the heavy double doors of Derek's study. He always locked them, assuming the solid brass deadbolt was enough to keep a supposedly senile old man out. But he had forgotten that I designed the security schematics for commercial bank vaults during my career. A standard residential deadbolt was nothing but a minor inconvenience. I pulled a thin, rigid piece of tension steel from my pocket, a tool I had slipped from the garage days earlier. I slid the metal past the door jamb, catching the angled latch, and applied a steady, practiced pressure. With a soft, almost imperceptible click, the lock gave way. I turned the handle, pushed the door open, slipped inside, and closed it gently behind me. I pulled a small penlight from my pocket, shielding the beam with my fingers, so only a narrow sliver of illumination pierced the darkness. I moved directly to his massive mahogany desk. I ran my hands underneath the heavy wooden panels, feeling for the hidden compartment. My fingers brushed against a subtle groove on the right side. I pushed on it, and a concealed panel slid back, revealing a sleek, modern biometric lock. It was a fingerprint scanner wired to an internal locking mechanism designed to secure a very deep, reinforced steel drawer built directly into the desk frame. Most people would have given up right there. They would have seen the glowing red scanner and assumed the drawer was completely impenetrable without Derek's thumbprint. But a biometric scanner is just a digital gatekeeper, relying on an electrical circuit to retract a physical pin. I did not need his fingerprint. I just needed to bypass the circuit. I reached into my other pocket and retrieved a tiny flathead screwdriver and a small coil of copper wire. I slid the tip of the screwdriver into the microscopic seam between the scanner plate and the wood, gently prying the casing loose. Internal wiring was exposed. 2 wires controlled data transfer, and 2 controlled power to the solenoid bolt. I carefully stripped the insulation from the power wires using my thumbnail. I twisted the copper wire around the positive and negative leads, effectively creating a temporary short circuit. Then, using the metal clip from my favorite pen, I manually grounded the connection directly to the metal housing of the lock. The electronic panel sparked once, a tiny flash of blue light, and the digital lock shorted out completely. With the power cut, the magnetic solenoid released its grip on the steel pin. I pulled the handle, and the heavy hidden drawer slid open smoothly on its oiled tracks. I shined my penlight down into the dark compartment, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm. The secrets my son had been guarding with such desperate paranoia were finally sitting right in front of me, waiting to be dragged out into the light. I reached my hand into the cold metal cavity of the hidden drawer. My fingers brushed against a thick stack of heavy manila folders. I pulled them out one by one, laying them flat on the polished mahogany surface of Derek's desk. I adjusted my penlight, balancing it between my teeth so the beam fell directly onto the center of the workspace, leaving the rest of the room cloaked in shadows. The house remained dead silent around me, save for the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the study windows. I opened the first folder. The label on the tab read, simply, funding. I expected to find standard business ledgers, maybe some exaggerated expense reports or hidden offshore accounts where my son was skimming from my savings. What I found was a meticulously constructed blueprint for my absolute financial ruin. The primary document inside the folder was a master commercial loan agreement. The lender was a prominent private equity firm based in Seattle, an organization known for aggressive lending practices and ruthless asset seizure. My eyes scanned the crisp black text, darting past the dense legal jargon until they locked onto the principal loan amount. $4 million. The numbers were printed in bold ink, staring back at me like a physical threat. I felt a cold chill radiate outward from my chest, pooling in my fingertips. I traced the lines of the contract, looking for the designated borrower. It was registered entirely to Derek's tech startup, a company he had endlessly boasted about, but which, according to the attached internal audit sheets, was hemorrhaging capital at a catastrophic rate. His brilliant enterprise was practically insolvent, a hollow shell desperate for an immediate infusion of cash to keep the servers running and the investors at bay. But a failing tech company with zero liquid assets cannot simply walk into a private equity firm and demand a $4 million lifeline. They needed a massive guarantee. They needed collateral. I turned to the next page of the heavy packet, illuminating the collateral schedule with the beam of my penlight. The breath caught in my throat. Listed right there, itemized with clinical precision, was the Bellevue estate. The very house I was currently standing inside, the property I had bought outright, with $2.5 million of my own hard-earned money, was pledged against a high-risk corporate loan. But the greed did not stop at the real estate. I moved the light further down the page, and my stomach plummeted. Derek had pledged everything. My Vanguard retirement portfolios, the high-yield mutual funds I had carefully managed for 3 decades, and even the fully vested pension from my engineering firm were all listed as secondary collateral. He had taken the entire sum of my life's labor, every hour of overtime, every delayed vacation, every sacrificed weekend, and placed it on the roulette table to fund his dying vanity project. If his startup defaulted on this aggressive loan, and the internal audit made it clear that a default was statistically imminent, the private equity firm would sweep in and legally seize it all. I would be left with absolutely nothing. I would be a penniless ward of the state, discarded and destitute exactly as they had planned. My analytical mind demanded to know the mechanics of the crime. The private equity firm would never approve a catastrophic transfer of risk like this without explicit, legally binding authorization from the primary asset holder. I flipped furiously through the remaining stack of papers, pulling out a heavy multi-page document bound by a blue legal cover. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. The document explicitly granted Derek complete, uncontested control over all my financial assets, real estate holdings, and medical decisions. It was the master key to my existence. I flipped to the final page to examine the execution block. There, resting on the signature line, was my name, Harrison Caldwell. I stared at the ink. It was a masterpiece of forgery. The slant of the capital letters, the hesitation in the double consonants, the sweeping loop of the final character. It was all perfectly replicated. Someone had studied my handwriting for hours, practicing the specific cadence of my stroke until they could reproduce it flawlessly. It was so accurate that if I did not know with absolute certainty that I had never signed this paper, I might have believed it was genuine. But a signature alone is never enough for a document of this magnitude. It required a notary. I shifted the penlight to the bottom corner of the page. The official embossed seal and the scrawled signature belonged to a local notary public named Richard Vance. I remembered that name. He was a frequent guest at Brittany's lavish dinner parties, a man who always laughed a little too loudly and drank a little too much of Derek's expensive scotch. Derek had not just forged my name. He had corrupted an official of the state, bribing a friend to stamp a fraudulent document, legally declaring that I had signed away my life in his presence. The sheer audacity of the conspiracy was staggering. They had weaponized the legal system against me, using my own money to buy the accomplices they needed to steal the rest of it. I stood there in the dark, the penlight trembling slightly in my grip, as the full scope of my son's sociopathy settled over me. He had not just been slipping me sedatives to keep me quiet. He had been chemically restraining me to ensure I could never walk into a bank and discover that my accounts were pledged to a predator. If I tried to protest, if I went to the police, Derek would simply present the forged power of attorney. He would waive the medical records he and Brittany had carefully orchestrated, the ones documenting my supposed dementia and severe cognitive decline. He would look the authorities in the eye, play the tragic, burdened son, and tell them his poor father no longer understood his own financial decisions. The trap was perfectly constructed, a flawless cage of paper and lies. I reached into my jacket pocket and retrieved my phone. I silenced the shutter sound and began to photograph every page of the loan agreement, the collateral schedule, and the forged power of attorney. I captured the notary seal, the corporate signatures, and the internal audit sheets proving the startup's insolvency. I moved with systematic precision, ensuring every image was perfectly legible. When the digital preservation was complete, I carefully stacked the folders in their original order. I placed them back into the deep metal cavity of the hidden drawer, sliding it shut until the magnetic pin engaged with a soft thud. I reattached the faceplate of the biometric scanner, pressing the tiny edges until they sat flush against the mahogany wood, leaving no trace of my intrusion. I slipped out of the study, locking the deadbolt behind me, and walked back to my guest room. I climbed into bed, my mind racing with cold calculations. I had the blueprint of their crime. Now, I just needed to design the demolition. I had the blueprint of their crime. Now I just needed to design the demolition. I let the memory of that night in the study fade, replaced by a much more recent, far more chilling revelation. Finding Derek's forged loan documents exposed the financial motive, but it had not fully explained the sheer malice of their daily behavior. I knew Derek was a coward trying to save his sinking company, but Brittany's cruelty felt entirely too calculated. I needed to understand her specific role in the architecture of this betrayal. The answer presented itself just 3 days before they finally threw my bags onto the front lawn. It was a crisp Sunday morning. Derek had left early for a corporate golf tournament, and Brittany had rushed out the door for a full day at a luxury spa. In her haste to leave, she had made a fatal error. She left her expensive silver tablet charging on the marble kitchen island completely unlocked. I had spent the morning reading in the guest room, my mind sharper than it had been in a year. When I walked into the kitchen to make a cup of black coffee, the screen of the tablet suddenly illuminated, chiming with a harsh notification sound. I froze, glancing around the empty house. I walked slowly toward the island. I looked down at the glowing screen. A text message preview was displayed, sent from a contact simply named Attorney Sterling. The preview read, "Draft is ready. Need the medical affidavits by Tuesday." My engineering instincts kicked in instantly. Because Brittany had been actively reading a digital magazine before she left, the device bypassed the passcode screen entirely and opened directly to her applications. I took a deep breath, steadying my hands, and opened her messaging application. I scrolled down to the thread with Attorney Sterling. The man was not a corporate lawyer. A quick mental review of the name reminded me of a sleazy local attorney known for handling aggressive conservatorships and hostile estate takeovers. I began to read the exchange from the beginning, my blood running colder with every line of text. Brittany was not merely a passive participant in Derek's financial fraud. She was the operational enforcer, the malicious architect of my physical demise. The messages from the past month detailed a methodical, terrifying strategy to neutralize me before the bank could ever discover the fraudulent collateral. I read a message she had sent 2 weeks prior. It said, "The sedatives are working perfectly. He sleeps 18 hours a day. He could not pass a cognitive baseline test if his life depended on it." The attorney replied, "Excellent. Keep the dosage consistent. The judge will want to see a documented pattern of severe decline before granting the emergency medical conservatorship." I gripped the edge of the marble counter, feeling a physical wave of nausea wash over me. But it was the most recent exchange, the messages sent just the night before, that revealed the absolute, unadulterated depth of their depravity. Brittany had typed a long, frantic paragraph. "Hurry up the mental incompetence declaration. Derek is panicking. We need the old man locked in a psych ward before the bank does their mandatory collateral audit next week. If the underwriters interview him, we are both going to federal prison." The attorney's response was cautious, warning her that expediting a psych hold required an immediate documented crisis. Brittany's reply was a masterpiece of pure evil. "Then we will create a crisis. I will just throw him out on the street tomorrow. He has no money and no memory. The state will pick him up, evaluate him, and lock him up for us. It solves everything in one move." I stood in the sunlit kitchen, staring at the digital words until they blurred. The tablet felt heavy and toxic in my hands. The level of their depravity was absolute. They were not merely stealing my life savings. They were actively plotting to have me institutionalized, stripped of my basic human rights, locked away in a psychiatric ward where no one would ever listen to my claims of fraud. They were going to throw me away like garbage so the state would take custody of me, making me a ward of the system, effectively silencing me forever. Every sweet smile Brittany had given me every time she gently patted my arm and told me to rest, it was all a calculated performance leading up to this ultimate disposal. I was a structural column they were preparing to dynamite. This horrifying discovery was the exact reason I remained so perfectly calm when she tossed my leather duffel down the porch steps earlier today. I already knew the script. I knew she was executing her plan to manufacture a crisis. She wanted me to panic, to wander the streets in a medicated daze, looking exactly like the lost dementia patient she needed me to be. By throwing me out, she believed she was putting the final nail in my coffin. She had no idea I had stopped taking the pills weeks ago. She had no idea I possessed photographic evidence of the $4 million loan forgery. And she certainly had no idea I had spent the last 3 days coordinating with Thomas to implement a countermeasure so devastating it would scorch the earth beneath their feet. I carefully closed her messaging application, locked the tablet screen, and left it exactly where I found it on the counter. Then, I packed my antique drafting tools and Martha's quilt, waiting for the inevitable moment they would spring their trap. Now, sitting in the silence of my hotel suite, the scotch burning pleasantly in my throat, I felt a profound sense of peace. The initial shock and heartbreak of my son's betrayal had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, hardened resolve. They had tried to break my mind and steal my legacy. They had vastly underestimated the man they were dealing with. An engineer never leaves a fatal flaw unaddressed. I picked up my smartphone from the side table and opened my secure email application. A fresh message from Thomas had arrived just 10 minutes ago. The subject line simply read, "Alpha Protocol Initiated." I opened the email and read the brief update. The preliminary injunctions had been filed with the federal court. The fraud alerts had been officially triggered at the private equity firm in Seattle. All accounts associated with Derek's startup and the Bellevue estate were now completely frozen. I slowly walked over to the tall floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The lights glittered against the dark sky, a complex network of power and structure. Derek and Brittany were somewhere out there in the Bellevue house celebrating my departure, entirely oblivious to the invisible wrecking ball swinging directly toward their perfect stolen lives. They wanted me entirely out of the house. I simply gave them exactly what they asked for. But I also took the foundation with me. The absolute final countdown had begun. And when the clock finally struck 0, I was going to ensure they felt every single crushing ounce of the collapse. The morning after I read those vile text messages on Brittany's iPad, I woke up before dawn. I knew I had to act immediately, but I also knew I could not break character. I had to remain the oblivious, deteriorating old man they believed me to be. I put on my worn canvas jacket, grabbed my tackle box, and shuffled into the kitchen. Brittany was sipping her morning espresso, scrolling through her phone. I forced my hands to tremble slightly as I reached for my travel mug. I told her in a low, raspy voice that I was going down to the lake to fish for a few hours. I said I just wanted some quiet time by the water to clear my head. She offered me that same sickeningly sweet, patronizing smile, likely thrilled that her problem was leaving the house for the morning. She handed me a bottle of water and reminded me to be careful, a perfect performance of a caring daughter-in-law. I nodded vaguely, walked out the front door, and climbed into my truck. I did not drive to the lake. I merged onto the interstate and headed straight for the glass and steel canyons of downtown Seattle. My destination was the towering high-rise that housed the law offices of Thomas Reynolds. Thomas was not just a lawyer. He was a legal architect who specialized in dismantling corporate predators. We had been friends for 2 decades, bonded by a shared appreciation for structural integrity and absolute precision. When I walked into his corner office, shedding my frail persona the moment his heavy oak door clicked shut, Thomas took one look at my face and knew something was catastrophically wrong. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I sat down across from his expansive mahogany desk, pulled out my smartphone, and laid out the digital evidence. I showed him the photographs of the forged power of attorney, the falsified property valuation, and the $4 million commercial loan agreement Derek had negotiated with the private equity firm. Then I showed him the screenshots of Brittany's text messages, detailing her plan to forcefully commit me to a psychiatric ward to cover their tracks. Thomas read through the files in complete silence. The ambient hum of the city traffic below was the only sound in the room. When he finally looked up, his jaw was clenched, and his eyes were dark with a cold, professional fury. He told me we needed to go straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He said we had enough evidence of bank fraud and elder abuse to have Derek and Brittany arrested before dinner. But I shook my head. I leaned forward and told Thomas that going to the authorities right now was the wrong structural move. If we simply handed this over to the police, the entire estate would be locked down in criminal litigation for years. The banks would freeze the assets, but the legal untangling would be a slow, bureaucratic nightmare. Derek and Brittany would immediately hire defense attorneys with the very money they had already siphoned from my accounts. They would claim a misunderstanding. They would fight the eviction, and they would continue living in my $2.5 million home while the justice system dragged its feet. I did not want a slow legal battle. I wanted a total instantaneous collapse of their reality. I wanted a mechanism that would trigger automatically removing all power from their hands before they even knew they were under attack. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his face. He understood exactly what I was asking for. He told me that if I wanted a tactical demolition, we needed to build a trap that Derek would detonate himself. That was when the Alpha Protocol was born. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering designed to turn Derek's own fraudulent momentum into the force that would destroy him. Thomas explained the mechanics of the trap with clinical precision. First, we would immediately transfer the deed of the Bellevue estate out of my personal name and into a highly secure, federally registered, blind trust managed exclusively by Thomas's corporate firm under an anonymous limited liability company. Because I was still of perfectly sound mind, and because I had the original untampered medical records to prove it, the transfer was entirely legal and binding. We executed the paperwork right then and there. I signed my name, my real unforged signature, establishing the irrevocable trust. The beauty of the Alpha Protocol lay in the automated federal tripwires Thomas built into the trust framework. By shielding the property under a federal corporate entity, any unauthorized attempt to place a lien against the estate would no longer be a simple matter of state-level forgery. It elevated the crime to a massive federal offense. Derek had already submitted the forged power of attorney to the private equity firm in Seattle. The underwriters were currently processing the $4 million loan, operating under the assumption that the collateral was free and clear. But the moment the lender's automated systems ran the final mandatory title audit to finalize the lien, they would hit the bedrock of the blind trust. Thomas set up a series of digital alerts tied directly to the property's title identification. The instant the private equity firm attempted to attach the loan to the house, the system would automatically reject the transaction and immediately flag the attempt as a severe wire fraud violation. The alert would instantly bounce back to the lender, notifying their security division that they were being actively defrauded using a falsified power of attorney. Furthermore, Thomas linked my investment portfolios to the same protective trust network. When the loan committee tried to verify the secondary collateral, they would trigger a secondary cascade of federal banking alerts. I sat in Thomas's office for 3 hours as his team expedited the filings. We built an invisible wall around my wealth, a wall wired with high-voltage legal electricity. Derek was driving 100 miles an hour toward a reinforced concrete barrier, completely blindfolded by his own arrogance. I thanked Thomas, shaking his hand with a firm, steady grip. He promised to monitor the tripwires personally and call me the moment the bank initiated the final audit. I drove to a local sporting goods store, bought a cheap fishing lure, and splashed a bit of stale lake water on my boots to complete the alibi. When I returned to the Bellevue estate that afternoon, the house was quiet. Brittany was in the kitchen casually slicing a grapefruit. I shuffled through the front door, looking tired and defeated, holding my empty fishing cooler. I apologized for not catching anything, blaming my poor eyesight and shaky hands. She patted my back and told me not to worry about it. I went to my room, lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The trap was armed. All I had to do was wait for my son to push the button. And today he finally pushed it. The absolute final countdown had begun. To understand how we arrived at that fateful Tuesday afternoon, with my belongings scattered across the front lawn in black plastic bags. I have to take you back to the days immediately following my secret meeting with Thomas. I had armed the Alpha Protocol, but a trap is entirely useless unless the prey is motivated to step directly onto the trigger plate. According to the forged loan documents I had photographed in Derek's study, the private equity firm was scheduled to conduct a mandatory physical collateral audit the following Wednesday. They needed to verify the occupancy and condition of the Bellevue estate before releasing the final $4 million disbursement. Derek and Brittany were running out of time. If a bank auditor showed up and found me completely lucid, their entire narrative would instantly collapse. The forged power of attorney would be scrutinized. The massive loan would be denied. They needed me gone, physically removed from the premises, and legally incapacitated in a psychiatric ward long before that auditor ever knocked on the front door. Brittany had already texted her sleazy lawyer about creating a crisis to justify throwing me out. I realized that if I sat back and waited, they might orchestrate something truly dangerous. I could not leave the timing to chance. I had to control the controlled demolition. I decided to accelerate their timeline. I was going to give Brittany the exact crisis she so desperately wanted, but I was going to script every single second of it. I began my performance on Friday morning, targeting the things she valued most in her superficial world. Brittany was exceptionally proud of the interior design she had commissioned for the main living room. Specifically, a massive imported white silk rug that cost more than most people earn in a year. She guarded that rug with ferocious intensity. I brewed a large mug of dark, scalding black coffee, filling it precariously close to the brim. I shuffled into the living room, dragging my feet, letting my shoulders slump. Brittany was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through her phone. I walked directly toward the center of the silk rug. I forced my hand to manifest a violent, sudden tremor. I let the mug slip from my grasp. It hit the floor with a loud crack, shattering into pieces and sending a tidal wave of dark coffee splashing across the pristine white silk. Brittany shrieked. It was not a gasp of concern. It was a visceral, high-pitched scream of pure materialistic agony. She jumped up from the sofa, staring at the spreading dark stain. I immediately hunched over, bringing my hands to my face, playing the role of the deeply confused, terrified patient. "I am sorry," I mumbled, my voice shaking. My hands just stopped working. I do not know what happened. Brittany did not ask if I was burned. She did not ask if I was hurt. Her polished facade completely dissolved, revealing the ugly, venomous core underneath. She glared at me with absolute disgust, her chest heaving. "You clumsy old fool," she hissed, her voice vibrating with rage. "Do you have any idea how much that costs? You ruin everything you touch." Derek rushed into the room, drawn by the shouting. He looked at the mess, then at me. There was no compassion in his eyes, only a cold, calculating annoyance. He pulled Brittany aside, whispering urgently to her, trying to calm her down. I stood there trembling externally, while my mind took meticulous notes. The structural integrity of her patience was fracturing perfectly. I did not stop there. Over the weekend, I systematically escalated the psychological pressure, targeting their daily conveniences. I gathered all the smart home controllers, the television remotes, and the garage door openers. I hid them in the most absurd, inaccessible places I could find, tucked inside bags of flour, in the pantry, buried beneath towels in the laundry room, shoved deep into the back of Derek's golf bag. When they realized the devices were missing, the house devolved into frantic chaos. I sat in my armchair, watching them tear the rooms apart, offering them vacant, bewildered stares when they demanded to know what I had done with them. I told them I thought the remotes were trying to steal my thoughts. I babbled nonsensically about radio waves. Brittany looked at me as if I were a diseased animal, her frustration visibly boiling over. To guarantee the breaking point, I decided to attack their sleep. Derek and Brittany guarded their rest, fiercely relying on it to maintain their high-energy lifestyles. At 3 o'clock on Monday morning, I crept out of my guest room and walked heavily up the grand staircase. I approached their master bedroom doors and began to knock, a loud, rhythmic pounding that echoed through the quiet house. I heard a muffled curse, and a moment later, Derek pulled the door open, his eyes bleary and furious. I looked at him with wide, unblinking eyes. "Derek," I said, my voice trembling with artificial panic. "Where is your mother? I cannot find Martha. She said she was making breakfast." Martha, my late wife, had been dead for 4 years. Derek rubbed his face, groaning in profound frustration. "Dad, Mom is dead. Go back to sleep. You are hallucinating again." But I refused to break character. I began to weep loud, wretched sobs, demanding to see my wife. Brittany appeared behind Derek, her face pale with exhaustion and absolute rage. "I cannot do this anymore, Derek," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I refuse to live in an asylum. He is completely losing his mind. He is destroying my house. He is hiding our things. And now he is screaming in the middle of the night. You promised me we would fix this. Fix it now." I backed away, shuffling slowly toward the stairs, continuing to murmur Martha's name, leaving them to their bitter argument. As I descended the steps, I listened carefully. The argument behind the closed doors was exactly what I needed to hear. Brittany was delivering her final ultimatum. She told him that she was executing her plan to pack my belongings and throw me out on the street the very next day. She insisted the state would find me wandering and lock me in a facility. She said it was the only way to ensure the bank auditor found an empty house by Wednesday. Derek the coward. I had raised, weakly agreed to the scheme. The trap was perfectly baited, and the prey had taken it without a single moment of hesitation. I returned to my room, lay down on the mattress, and smiled into the darkness. I had successfully manipulated the manipulators. When Tuesday morning arrived, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken hostility. I went through the motions of my routine, dressing slowly in my old canvas jacket. I told them I was going fishing down by the lake, fully aware that I was handing them the exact window of opportunity they required. I walked out the front door, climbed into my truck, and drove away, knowing the Alpha Protocol was finally ready to detonate. The drive to the lake that Tuesday morning was the most peaceful journey I had taken in nearly a year. I did not actually care about catching fish. I simply needed to be absent. I needed to give Brittany and Derek the empty house and the manufactured crisis they required to execute their own downfall. Before stepping out of the mudroom, I had made one final calculated move. I deliberately stepped into a puddle of thick, dark clay near the garden hose, heavily coating the soles of my boots. I then walked directly across the cheap woven runner rug that Brittany kept by the back door. It was an insignificant piece of fabric, practically worthless compared to the silk masterpiece I had ruined the day prior, but it was the final, undeniable insult. I left a trail of muddy footprints ground deep into the fibers, a blatant, messy declaration of my supposed senility. I knew exactly how she would react. The ruined silk rug had cracked her facade, but the muddy, cheap runner would shatter it. It was the perfect petty catalyst. Sitting in my small aluminum boat, casting a line into the dark water of the lake, I visualized the chaos unfolding back at the estate. I could picture Brittany discovering the mud, her face turning crimson, her voice echoing through the high ceilings as she screamed at Derek. I could see them frantically grabbing the heavy black plastic trash bags, tearing through my guest room, blindly shoving my clothing, my antique drafting tools, and Martha's quilt into the dark plastic. They were moving with the desperate, adrenaline-fueled speed of criminals trying to sanitize a crime scene. They believed they were cleaning house. They believed that by physically removing my presence, they were removing the liability of a bank auditor interviewing a lucid legal co-owner of the property. What they failed to understand was the fundamental law of leverage. In their blind rush to evict me, they were officially establishing my non-residence. They were severing the final thread of plausible deniability they held over me. When I finally reeled in my dry line and drove the truck back to Bellevue that afternoon, the sight of those 6 black bags on the manicured front lawn was not a shock. It was a victory banner. Brittany's triumphant face, her command to go live at the dump, and Derek's cowardly retreat into the shadows were perfectly executed lines in a script I had written. They had played their parts with flawless, predictable greed. I walked away with Martha's quilt under my arm, completely liberated, leaving them trapped in the epicenter of the blast radius. The transition from that toxic suburban lawn to the pristine silence of my downtown luxury hotel suite had been a physical and mental exhalation. Now sitting in the heavy armchair overlooking the glittering Seattle skyline, the smooth heat of the scotch warming my chest, it was time to trigger the final charge. The Alpha Protocol had already frozen the assets and triggered the internal wire fraud alerts at the private equity firm. Thomas and his legal team had successfully erected the barrier. But a barrier only stops the vehicle. It does not arrest the driver. For that, I needed to make a direct, undeniable statement on the official record. I needed to introduce the human element of the fraud. I set my crystal glass down on the small table beside me. The condensation left a perfect temporary ring on the polished wood. I picked up my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light of the suite. I opened my contacts and retrieved the direct unlisted phone number for the primary fraud division of the private equity firm. I had memorized the 10 digits from the internal audit sheets I had photographed in Derek's hidden desk drawer. This was not the customer service line. This was the direct line to the financial investigators, the people whose entire careers were dedicated to destroying corporate fraudsters. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. The line rang precisely 3 times before it was answered. The voice on the other end was sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of warmth. Fraud Investigations Agent Miller speaking. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the city lights outside my window. I did not let a single trace of emotion enter my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of an engineer reporting a critical stress fracture in a support beam. "My name is Harrison Caldwell," I said. There was a very brief pause on the line. I could hear the rapid, muffled clicking of a keyboard as the agent immediately ran my name through their active client database. I knew exactly what was popping up on his screen. A pending $4 million commercial loan for Derek's tech startup secured by a forged, durable power of attorney, bearing my name, and collateralized by the Bellevue estate and my entire lifetime retirement portfolio. "Mr. Caldwell," the agent said, his voice instantly dropping an octave, taking on an edge of intense, focused urgency. "We have an active high-priority alert regarding a substantial commercial loan application submitted under your legal authority. Are you calling regarding the Bellevue property collateral?" "Yes," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "I am calling to make an official recorded statement regarding that specific loan application and the property in question. I need you to document this immediately." The clicking of the keyboard stopped. The agent's breathing was audible over the line. "Go ahead, Mr. Caldwell. This line is secure and fully recorded." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the weight of the last 8 months completely detach from my shoulders. The chemical fog, the missing keys, the humiliating dinner parties, the stolen mail, the desperate plotting to have me locked inside a psychiatric ward. All of it vanished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the strike. "I am not a resident at the Bellevue property," I stated clearly, letting the words hang in the silent hotel room. "I was forcibly evicted from the premises this afternoon by my son Derek Caldwell and his wife Brittany. Furthermore, I have never signed a power of attorney granting Derek control over my financial assets. I have not authorized any commercial loans. I have not pledged my retirement portfolios as collateral for any business venture. The documents submitted to your firm bearing my signature are absolute, unadulterated forgeries. My son is attempting to defraud your institution for $4 million. The silence on the line was profound. It was the sound of an explosive charge detonating deep underground, catastrophic at the foundation. The C4 was detonated. Agent Miller finally exhaled. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice devoid of its corporate detachment, "we will take it from here. I am initiating the full fraud protocol immediately." I ended the call and lowered the phone to my lap. I leaned my head back, staring out at the glowing city. The collapse had truly begun. The morning sun crested over the rugged peaks of the Montana wilderness, spilling golden light across the heavy timber beams of my luxury cabin. I had flown out of Seattle late Sunday night on a private charter Thomas had arranged, leaving the toxicity of the Bellevue estate behind me. I sat on the wooden deck, a mug of local coffee warming my hands, breathing in the crisp mountain air. It was Monday morning. At precisely 9 a.m. Pacific time, the financial markets opened, and the automated mechanisms of the Alpha Protocol engaged with lethal efficiency. I did not wait long for confirmation. My secure smartphone chimed on the rustic table. It was a direct message from Thomas. The text was brief reading. "The guillotine has dropped. The underwriters at the private equity firm had attempted to process the collateral lien against the Bellevue property to disperse the $4 million loan. The moment their digital request struck the heavily fortified federal blind trust, the system rejected the transaction. That rejection instantly generated a priority wire fraud alert cascading through the centralized banking networks. Within minutes, every financial institution associated with Derek Caldwell received a catastrophic red flag. The algorithms operated without emotion. They immediately froze Derek's primary business accounts, his personal checking accounts, and the joint credit lines he shared with Brittany. The liquidity they relied upon to project their false image of wealth evaporated in a fraction of a second. They were completely severed from the financial grid, locked out of their stolen kingdom. I took a slow sip of my coffee, listening to the rustle of the wind. I imagined Derek sitting in his downtown office, suddenly unable to authorize a basic vendor payment, staring in cold panic at a glowing red error message. Derek was a coward who would hide behind closed doors to process his ruin. Brittany required an audience. 30 minutes later, Thomas sent a second encrypted message containing a large video file. The short caption read, "The immediate fallout." I opened the file. The footage was shaky, captured on a cellular phone by an anonymous bystander inside a designer boutique in downtown Seattle. The lighting was immaculate, illuminating rows of expensive leather handbags. Standing directly in front of the marble checkout counter was Brittany. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and a tailored cashmere coat, tapping her foot with visible impatience. The young retail associate behind the register looked terrified. The clerk held a sleek black credit card, swiping it through the terminal for the third consecutive time. I watched the clerk shake her head, offering a nervous smile. "I am so sorry, ma'am," the clerk stammered. "The terminal is saying the card is declined. It is instructing me to confiscate the physical card." Brittany snatched the sunglasses off her face, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom. "That is absolutely impossible," she snapped. "Run it again. You are clearly doing it wrong. Do you have any idea how much money I spend in this store? Run the card." The clerk stepped back, holding the black card against her chest. "I cannot run it again, ma'am. The bank has placed a hard lock on the account. Do you have another form of payment?" Brittany ripped open her designer handbag, her manicured fingers digging frantically. She produced a silver platinum card and threw it onto the marble counter. It hit the surface with a sharp clatter. "Use that one," she ordered, her tone dripping with absolute condescension. "And I expect a discount for this humiliating inconvenience." The clerk picked up the silver card with trembling hands. She inserted the chip into the terminal. The machine beeped a harsh tone. The clerk looked at the screen, her face draining of color. "Mom, this account is also locked. Both cards are showing a severe fraud alert restriction. I have to call our security division." That was the exact moment the structural integrity of Brittany's fabricated reality completely collapsed. She erupted. The footage captured the precise second her polished facade shattered to reveal the unhinged narcissism beneath. She slammed her hands down on the marble counter, leaning aggressively toward the employee. "Are you completely incompetent?" she screamed, drawing the shocked stares of every patron in the boutique. "My husband runs a massive technology corporation. We live in a $2 million estate. Your stupid machine is broken. Call your manager right now. I want you fired and these items bagged immediately." The bystander recording the video stepped closer, capturing the raw desperation on Brittany's face. She was flailing her arms, knocking a display of expensive silk scarves onto the hardwood floor. She demanded to speak to the corporate office. She threatened to sue the boutique and the bank. Her voice grew shrill, cracking under the weight of her public humiliation. Two security guards approached, asking her to lower her voice and step away from the register. "Do not touch me," Brittany shrieked, swatting at a guard who reached out to guide her away. "You have no idea who I am. You are all going to pay for this. I am calling my attorney." The video ended abruptly as a security guard escorted her toward the doors, her voice echoing with vicious threats. I sat the phone down on the table, the Montana silence rushing back in. The visual evidence of her downfall was absolute. Thomas sent a note confirming that the video had been uploaded to a local community forum. It had garnered tens of thousands of views, spreading rapidly across networks under the caption of a wealthy socialite throwing a massive retail tantrum. Her curated image, the flawless reputation she had built, was completely obliterated in 3 minutes. The financial guillotine had severed their lifelines perfectly. They had no access to cash. They could not leverage the house. Derek's startup was effectively dead in the water, unable to process payroll or vendor debt. Brittany was currently a viral laughingstock, permanently banned from her favorite luxury store, wandering the streets of Seattle with a wallet full of useless frozen plastic. I finished my coffee. The dark liquid tasted exceptionally good. I stood up and walked to the edge of the large deck, looking out over the pine forest. They thought they had discarded a broken, senile old man. They never considered the simple engineering principle that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The undeniable, crushing reaction was finally here. The foundation was gone, and the heavy structural load of their lies was crashing down upon them. The most satisfying part of this orchestrated demolition was that I did not have to lift a single finger to cause the final collapse. I had simply built the framework, stepped away, and allowed their own insatiable greed to pull the trigger. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the pure mountain air. The first phase of the Alpha Protocol was a complete success, but I knew Derek intimately. He would scramble, panic, and try to find a tiny legal loophole. I was ready for whatever maneuver he attempted next, secure in the knowledge that every exit door had already been sealed shut. Tuesday morning brought a new kind of storm. I was sitting by the stone fireplace in the Montana cabin, watching the heavy rain wash over the tall pine trees, when my secure phone vibrated against the wooden table. It was a direct call from Thomas. I answered, expecting a standard update on the frozen bank accounts, or perhaps another satisfying report of Brittany publicly unraveling in a retail store. Instead, Thomas sounded entirely breathless, a rare occurrence for a corporate attorney who had spent decades ruthlessly dismantling hostile takeovers. He told me the situation had escalated far beyond a simple civil fraud investigation. The federal tripwires we had meticulously installed in the blind trust had not just flagged the private equity firm in Seattle. The automated alert had cascaded upward through the banking system, triggering a massive automated review by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My tactical demolition had inadvertently exposed a much darker, much more dangerous foundation beneath Derek's financial house of cards. Thomas explained that his legal team had spent the entire night digging through the corporate filings of my son's supposedly brilliant tech startup. What they found was not just a failing enterprise, but a meticulously constructed criminal operation. At exactly 8 o'clock that morning, a fleet of dark, unmarked government vehicles had rolled up the long, manicured driveway of the Bellevue estate. Thomas had gained access to the neighborhood security feed through a highly placed contact in the local precinct. He described the dramatic scene to me with grim satisfaction. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical vests bearing the bold yellow letters of the federal agencies had bypassed the wrought iron gates and surrounded the property. They did not ring the doorbell and wait politely for an answer. They executed a coordinated raid, breaching the massive front doors with a heavy steel battering ram. I closed my eyes easily, visualizing the heavy mahogany doors splintering inward, the polished marble floors echoing with the heavy boots of armed federal investigators. Derek and Brittany were dragged out of their luxurious master suite in their expensive silk pajamas, handcuffed and forced to sit on the ruined white silk rug in the living room, while agents systematically dismantled their sanctuary. They seized every computer, every tablet, every financial ledger, and every single document hidden in that secret biometric desk drawer. The impenetrable fortress they thought they owned had been completely overrun in less than 10 minutes. The reality of Derek's corporate genius was a horrifying illusion. Thomas laid out the facts with surgical precision over the secure line. The tech startup had never produced a single viable product or generated any legitimate revenue. It was a classic, desperate Ponzi scheme. For the past 2 years, Derek had been illegally soliciting massive investments from vulnerable venture capitalists, using the fresh capital to pay fake dividends to earlier investors, while actively skimming millions off the top, to secretly fund his and Brittany's incredibly lavish lifestyle. But traditional corporate investors were not the only people Derek had defrauded. When the legitimate capital eventually dried up, my son had grown overwhelmingly desperate. He had turned to underground lending syndicates, dangerous loan sharks, operating out of illicit offshore networks. He had borrowed heavily from ruthless men who did not file civil lawsuits when a scheduled payment was missed. They were violent men who broke legs and threatened lives. The $4 million commercial loan from the Seattle private equity firm was never meant to save the failing startup. It was a panicked, last-ditch attempt to pay off the underground syndicate before they came to collect their massive debt in blood. By illegally pledging my entire retirement portfolio and the unencumbered Bellevue estate, Derek was literally trying to buy his own physical survival. When the Alpha Protocol automatically froze that commercial loan, it did not just cut off their infinite spending money. It effectively signed Derek's death warrant with the violent syndicate and handed him directly to the federal government on a silver platter. Thomas informed me that the prosecutors were already actively drafting the heavy criminal indictments. Between the massive wire fraud, the grand larceny, the corporate tax evasion, and the blatant document forgery, my son was looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison. There was absolutely no plea deal that could magically save him from the sheer overwhelming volume of his documented crimes. He was completely cornered, legally stripped of his stolen assets, and facing a miserable lifetime behind heavy steel bars. But Derek was a desperate cornered animal, and cornered animals are highly unpredictable. According to Thomas's latest intelligence, Derek had miraculously bonded out of temporary federal custody late Tuesday afternoon. His sleazy private attorney had somehow managed to secure a conditional release pending the formal grand jury indictment. Derek was out, but he had only one impossible, completely unhinged way out of the impending prison sentence. He frantically needed me. He desperately needed the supposedly senile, helpless old man he had carelessly thrown away like garbage. The sleazy attorney had explicitly informed him that the only legal maneuver to introduce reasonable doubt into the federal forgery charges was to produce a newly signed, fully notarized affidavit directly from me, legally validating the original forged power of attorney. If he could somehow force me to swear under penalty of perjury that I had actually authorized those massive financial transactions, he could aggressively claim the federal fraud alert was simply a massive, catastrophic banking error caused by a confused old man. Derek needed to locate me immediately, drag me into a lawyer's office, and force a pen into my hand before the federal prosecutors finalized their devastating case. Sitting in the quiet luxury of the Montana cabin, I finally understood the absolute terrifying magnitude of the situation. Derek was not just fighting for his stolen wealth anymore. He was actively fighting for his freedom and his literal life. He knew that if the underground syndicate reached him before the federal agents placed him in protective custody, he would not survive the week. I was the only key to his survival. I pictured him tearing through the streets of Seattle, frantically calling hospitals, shelters, and police stations, desperately searching for the vulnerable father he had chemically restrained and abandoned. He would be sweating, his heart racing, with pure, unadulterated panic, realizing that his ultimate disposal plan had spectacularly backfired. He had thrown me out to solve a simple audit problem, But by doing so, he had lost his only living shield against a federal prison sentence. I took a slow, deep breath, finishing my coffee as I watched the storm rage outside. The trap had sprung, the feds had arrived, and the hunt had begun. I was entirely ready for him, but I knew I could not stay hidden in the woods forever. The final confrontation was absolutely inevitable, and I welcomed it. I wanted to look my treacherous son directly in the eyes and watch him finally realize that the broken old man he tried to throw away was the master architect of his total, inescapable, and devastating ultimate downfall. I smiled quietly into the cool mountain morning. Wednesday dawned over the Montana wilderness with a brilliant, unforgiving clarity. It was day 3 of the Alpha Protocol, and the absolute destruction of my son was accelerating faster than even Thomas had predicted. While I sat on the cedar deck of my secluded luxury cabin, sipping freshly ground coffee and listening to the wind move through the heavy pine branches, a profound and beautiful chaos was consuming Seattle. Thomas had established a secure digital pipeline directly to my tablet, funneling real-time updates from his network of private investigators and local legal contacts. I spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the latest reports. The situation for Derek and Brittany had officially crossed the threshold from sheer panic into absolute, unadulterated madness. They were completely out of options. The federal government had frozen every liquid asset they possessed, and the violent underground lending syndicate was undoubtedly tracking their every move. Derek was currently facing 2 distinct but equally terrifying outcomes. He could either spend the next 2 decades rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, or he could answer to the ruthless men who had funded his fraudulent technology startup. His expensive private defense attorney had made the reality painfully clear. Derek had to locate me. He desperately needed his supposedly senile father to sign a retroactive, legally binding affidavit validating that forged power of attorney. It was his singular, pathetic lifeline. He needed to drag me into a sterile conference room and force my trembling hand to sign a document claiming the entire $4 million loan application was a legitimate family business strategy. Because they could not access their frozen bank accounts to hire private security firms or professional trackers, Derek and Brittany were forced to conduct the search themselves. The poetic justice of their predicament was incredibly, deeply satisfying. According to the surveillance reports, Thomas provided my son and his vicious wife spent the entire day driving frantically through the most dangerous, forgotten neighborhoods of the city. They were actively searching for me in the exact miserable locations where they had maliciously intended to abandon me just 48 hours prior. I pictured them in their expensive luxury vehicle, sweating through their designer clothing as they navigated the crowded streets around the downtown homeless shelters. They parked outside overflowing free clinics and charity soup kitchens, desperately questioning the overwhelmed volunteers. They marched into local police precincts, demanding that officers prioritize the search for a vulnerable senior citizen. They described a confused, deteriorating old man suffering from severe dementia who had tragically wandered away from his loving family. They handed out recent photographs of me, their faces twisted into masks of fabricated concern. They begged shelter directors to check their intake logs, terrified that I might be sitting on a cot in a crowded gymnasium, unable to remember my own name. They had no idea that I had casually driven out of the state the moment they threw my bags onto the lawn. I was hundreds of miles away, completely lucid, breathing the clean mountain air, while they scoured the dirty gutters of the city. Their desperate hunt yielded absolutely nothing. They were chasing a phantom, a medically incapacitated version of myself that had never actually existed. As the sun began to set on Seattle, their physical exhaustion gave way to a new level of psychological terror. They realized the physical search was a complete failure. When the physical search proved entirely useless, Brittany resorted to the only arena where she still felt she possessed a semblance of control. She turned to the court of public opinion. Late that evening, my tablet chimed with an incoming message from Thomas. The message contained no text, only a direct link to a local social media platform. I tapped the screen and a high-definition video immediately began to play. It was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. Brittany was sitting on the sofa in their grand living room. She had deliberately scrubbed her face clean of all makeup, leaving her skin looking pale and artificially distressed. Her perfectly styled hair was intentionally mussed, and she was wearing a simple, oversized gray sweater to project an aura of vulnerable misery. She stared directly into the camera lens, her eyes welling with forced, heavy tears. "Please," she whimpered, her voice breaking with a flawlessly rehearsed tremor. "We desperately need the help of our community. My beloved father-in-law, Harrison Caldwell, has gone missing." She paused, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth, allowing a single tear to dramatically roll down her cheek. "He has been suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia. He is terribly confused, very frightened, and completely unable to care for himself. He wandered away from our home on Tuesday morning, and we are absolutely heartbroken. Derek and I have been driving for days, searching every hospital and shelter, but we cannot find him. He is our family. We love him so much. Please, if anyone has seen an elderly gentleman matching this description, contact the authorities immediately. We just want our dad back safe and sound. We cannot bear the thought of him being alone out there in the cold." I watched the video loop 3 consecutive times in the quiet solitude of the mountain cabin. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her performance was staggering. This was the exact same woman who had viciously cursed me for spilling coffee on a silk rug. This was the woman who had gleefully texted a sleazy lawyer about manufacturing a crisis so the state would permanently lock me inside a psychiatric ward. Now she was weeping on the internet, begging the world to help find her cherished family member. The hypocrisy was so dense, it felt physically heavy. She was not crying out of love or concern. She was crying because she was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment, and her only legal shield had completely evaporated into the wind. She wanted her dad back only so she could drag him into a lawyer office, exploit his signature, and save herself from a devastating prison sentence. I reached out and calmly turned the tablet screen downward against the wooden table, silencing her fabricated sobs. I felt absolutely no sympathy, no lingering shred of paternal hesitation. Their public desperation was merely the final confirmation that my tactical strike had achieved absolute perfection. They had built a massive fortress of lies, relying on my perceived weakness to sustain their criminal greed. By simply removing my presence, I had pulled the foundational keystone out from under them. The social media video was nothing more than the pathetic flailing of a sinking ship. The federal authorities were already actively monitoring all of their digital communications, gathering even more evidence as Derek and Brittany desperately tried to cover their tracks. The violent underground lenders were undoubtedly watching that exact same video, realizing their debtor was rapidly losing control of his circumstances. The walls were closing in on them from every possible direction. I leaned back quietly in my chair, looking up at the darkening Montana sky. Tomorrow I would slowly prepare for the final confrontation. The morning sun gave way to a brooding, overcast afternoon in the Montana mountains. I spent the day resting, breathing in the scent of pine and rain, allowing my mind to fully clear before the final phase of my operation. By early evening, a dense fog had rolled in, blanketing the valleys and isolating my luxury cabin from the rest of the world. I walked over to the small rustic wet bar in the corner of the living room and poured myself a generous measure of aged single malt whiskey. The heavy crystal glass felt grounding in my hand. I walked toward the stone fireplace, watching the flames crackle and spit, enjoying the profound silence. That silence was abruptly shattered by the sharp, jarring ring of my secure smartphone resting on the coffee table. I had explicitly instructed Thomas to block all incoming calls from Derek and Brittany, rerouting their known numbers to a dead server. But the number flashing on my screen was entirely unfamiliar. It was an out-of-state area code, an unregistered burner phone purchased with whatever meager, untraceable cash Derek had managed to scrape together. I did not answer. I stood perfectly still, letting the device ring until it automatically transferred to my secure voicemail. A minute later, a notification chimed indicating a voice message had been deposited. I set my glass of whiskey on the mantel, picked up the phone, and pressed play. The audio filled the quiet room, and the voice that spilled out of the speaker was practically unrecognizable. It was not the smooth, arrogant cadence of the affluent technology executive who had paraded me around his dinner parties like a broken prop. It was the high-pitched, breathless sobbing of a terrified, cornered animal. "Dad! Dad, please, you have to pick up." Derek's voice cracked violently, punctuated by frantic gasps for air. I could hear the ambient noise of a busy street in the background, the blare of a distant siren making him pause in sheer panic. "I know you are out there. I know you can hear this. You have to help me. They have frozen everything. The bank, the federal investigators, they came into the house. They took all my computers. They took the files. They are going to seize the Bellevue estate by Friday. Brittany is staying at a cheap motel, and I cannot even go back to my own property." Derek dissolved into a fit of heavy weeping, a wet, pathetic sound that carried absolutely no genuine remorse for his actions against me. He was solely mourning the sudden loss of his stolen empire. But the weeping quickly transitioned into a dark, frantic desperation. "Dad, please, they are going to seize the house, but that is not the worst part. Dangerous people are looking for me. Men who do not care about court dates or federal indictments. They lent me capital for the startup, and they are demanding their payment right now. I had the money ready. The $4 million commercial loan was approved. It was supposed to clear yesterday, but some automated system locked it down and triggered a federal alert. I need you. I desperately need you to come back to Seattle. I had my attorney draft a simple affidavit. All you have to do is sign the papers. You just have to swear to the bank and the federal prosecutors that you authorized the power of attorney. If you sign the document, the fraud charges go away. The loan clears. I can pay these people before they find me. You have to sign the papers, Dad. If you do not do this, I am going to federal prison for 20 years, or these men are going to put me in the ground. Please, Dad. You are my father. You have to save my life." The message ended with a final, desperate sob before the line went dead. I stood in the center of the cabin listening to the static hum of the finished recording. I slowly reached out, picked up my heavy crystal glass, and took a long, deliberate sip of the aged whiskey. The warm liquid cascaded down my throat, matching the cold, absolute certainty settling deep within my chest. I felt no pity. I felt no parental obligation to throw myself on a grenade he had willfully manufactured. He had chemically restrained me, forged my signature, pledged my entire life savings to a ruthless private equity firm, and conspired with his wife to abandon me to a state-run psychiatric ward. And now, facing the lethal consequences of his own boundless greed, he still viewed me as nothing more than a convenient tool for his salvation. He actually believed that his tears and his desperate invocation of my title as his father would magically erase 8 months of calculated psychological torture. He believed I would gladly commit federal perjury, sacrificing my own clean name to shield him from the violent syndicate he had recklessly invited into our lives. The sheer towering narcissism required to leave that voicemail was almost impressive. He was a drowning man, demanding that I tie his heavy anchor around my own neck. I walked over to the large wooden dining table and opened my laptop. The time for hiding in the peaceful wilderness was officially over. Derek wanted his father back in Seattle. I was fully prepared to grant him his wish, but I would not be returning as the confused, compliant victim he so desperately needed. I would be arriving as the architect of his final reckoning. I opened a secure browsing window and navigated to a private airline portal. I quickly selected a direct first-class flight, departing from Bozeman, Montana, to the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, scheduled for the very next morning. I paid for the premium ticket using an untraceable corporate account Thomas had established for me within the blind trust. I received the confirmation itinerary instantly. I closed the laptop, finished the last remaining drop of my whiskey, and began to pack my leather duffel bag. I folded my clothes methodically, placing Martha's antique quilt gently at the bottom. I packed my drafting tools, snapping the brass latches of the wooden case shut. Every movement was precise and intentional. I was preparing for a controlled demolition, and the structural integrity of my mind was flawless. Once my bag was packed and resting by the front door of the cabin, I retrieved my smartphone from the coffee table. I opened a new text message window and manually entered the unregistered phone number Derek had just used to leave his pathetic voicemail. I did not offer any words of comfort. I did not acknowledge his tears, his fear of the dangerous underground syndicate, or his desperate pleas for my signature. I simply typed a single, highly specific destination. The address belonged to the heavily fortified downtown law office of Thomas Reynolds. I added one final, unyielding instruction to the message before hitting send. I told my traitorous son to meet me there on Thursday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, or I would vanish forever. The board was perfectly set. Checkmate was rapidly approaching. Finally, the flight from Montana to Seattle was a study in profound tranquility. I sat in the spacious leather seat of the first-class cabin, watching the rugged landscape yield to the sprawling urban grid of the Pacific Northwest. There was no anxiety in my chest, no lingering paternal hesitation. The man who had desperately sought his son's approval by enduring humiliating dinners and chemical fog was entirely dead. In his place sat an architect of absolute ruin. Thomas Reynolds was waiting for me when the private car pulled up to his downtown high-rise. We rode the private elevator in comfortable silence, the polished steel doors opening to reveal the pristine, intimidating environment of his legal fortress. I walked directly into the primary boardroom and took my seat at the exact head of the massive mahogany conference table. Thomas stood quietly by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands clasped behind his back, a thick manila folder resting ominously on the polished wood in front of me. We did not have to wait long. At precisely 2 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the conference room violently swung open. The two individuals who stumbled over the threshold were utterly unrecognizable from the arrogant, polished socialites who had confidently thrown black plastic trash bags onto my front lawn just a few days prior. Derek and Brittany looked completely destroyed. They carried the distinct foul odor of stale sweat, cheap motel rooms, and raw, unadulterated panic. Derek was wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt from Tuesday, the collar heavily stained and completely unbuttoned. His hands were shaking so violently that the legal documents he clutched rattled against each other. His face was pale, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped rodent seeking an impossible exit. Brittany was in an even worse state of deterioration. The expensive designer facade had totally melted away. Her hair was greasy and matted against her skull. She wore stained yoga pants and a massive oversized sweatshirt that seemed to swallow her shrinking frame. The moment her frantic eyes locked onto me, sitting calmly at the head of the table, she let out a loud, pathetic gasp. She did not hesitate. She rushed forward, her legs seemingly giving out, as she threw herself entirely onto the plush carpet. She crawled the last few feet, falling heavily to her knees, directly beside my chair. She reached out with trembling, unwashed hands, attempting to grasp the fabric of my trousers. "Dad!" She sobbed, her voice a wet, breathless shriek that echoed harshly against the acoustic panels of the boardroom. "Thank God you are here. We have been looking everywhere for you. We were so terrified that something terrible had happened. Please, you have to listen to us. You have to save us. They took everything. The bank froze our accounts. We do not have any money for food or a safe place to sleep. Please, Dad, you are our only family. You have to help us." Derek stumbled forward, standing over his weeping wife, his chest heaving as he slammed a stack of heavily creased papers onto the mahogany table. "Dad, you have to sign these right now," he demanded, his voice cracking with a high, unnatural pitch. "You have to date it for last month. It is a retroactive affidavit. It just says you authorized the power of attorney. It says the $4 million loan was a legitimate joint business venture. If you sign this, the federal agents will drop the wire fraud charges. The bank will release the funds. I can pay off the lenders before they find me. They are dangerous men, Dad. They know where I am. You have to sign it or I am a dead man. He fumbled in his pocket, producing a silver pen, and thrust it toward my face. The metal tip trembled violently in the air. He was breathing through his mouth, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. Just sign your name, he begged, the aggressive demand crumbling into a pathetic, desperate whine. Just write your name and everything goes back to normal. We can go back to the estate. We can be a family again. I did not take the pen. I did not move a single muscle. I sat perfectly still, letting his frantic words hang in the cold, sterile air of the boardroom. I slowly lowered my gaze to look at Brittany, who was still kneeling on the floor, her tear-streaked face looking up at me with an expression of intense, calculated manipulation. She was still trying to play the part of the devoted, terrified daughter. She was still treating me like a senile, easily controlled asset. I looked at her with absolute, unwavering ice in my eyes. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. You lost the house 3 days ago when you told me to go live at the municipal dump, I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Brittany's mouth fell open, her fake sobs instantly catching in her throat. The color drained entirely from her face as the profound reality of my clear, sharp articulation finally penetrated her panic. She looked at Derek, pure horror replacing the manufactured grief in her eyes. The old broken man they thought they were dealing with was gone. The carefully constructed illusion of my dementia had just been entirely shattered with a single calm sentence. Derek dropped the silver pen. It hit the mahogany table with a sharp, echoing clatter. "Dad," he whispered, taking a slow step backward. "What are you saying?" "You do not understand. The house is collateral. They are going to seize it. We are going to be completely homeless." "I understand perfectly," I replied, keeping my eyes locked on his pale, sweating face. "I understand that your tech startup has never generated a single dollar of legitimate revenue. I understand that you have been operating a massive illegal Ponzi scheme for the past 2 years. I understand that you borrowed heavy capital from violent underground syndicates. And when the money ran out, you forged my signature to steal $4 million from a private equity firm to save your own life. I understand every single detail of your pathetic criminal existence." Derek stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. He looked like a fish suffocating on a dry deck. He slowly turned his head toward Thomas, who remained standing quietly by the massive window. Thomas stepped forward. He did not offer a greeting. He simply reached down and picked up the thick manila folder resting on the table. He opened the cover with a deliberate heavy motion and dropped the contents directly over Derek's desperate, unsigned affidavit. A massive stack of official government documents spilled across the polished wood. The papers bore the heavy, unmistakable seals of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They detailed the massive wire fraud, the endless illegal banking transfers, and the grand larceny. Pinned to the very top was a certified forensic report, conclusively proving that his signature on the legal documents was a completely undeniable criminal forgery. He was trapped. Derek stared at the heavy stack of federal documents, his eyes darting frantically across the bold black text and the official government seals. His breath hitched in his throat, producing a pathetic hollow wheeze. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingertips brushing the edges of the certified forensic report, as if touching it would somehow alter the devastating reality it presented. The brilliant, infallible corporate executive was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified criminal realizing that he had engineered his own absolute ruin. Brittany knelt, frozen on the plush carpet beside my chair, her face contorted in an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She was no longer performing for an audience. The tears that began to slide down her pale cheeks were genuinely born of profound, inescapable terror. "I'm not going to sign your retroactive affidavit, Derek," I stated, my voice echoing evenly across the vast expanse of the mahogany conference table. "I am not going to commit federal perjury to save a son who chemically restrained me, stole my life savings, and conspired to lock me inside a state-run psychiatric ward so he could continue living a lavish, fraudulent lie. You made a series of highly calculated, malicious choices over the past 2 years. You assumed that my age equated to weakness. You believed my silence indicated ignorance. You were completely wrong, and now you are going to pay the ultimate uncompromising price for your arrogance. Derek dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders heaving with violent, pathetic sobs. Dad. Please, he choked out the words muffled by his shaking fingers. You do not understand what these men will do to me. They are going to kill me. You cannot just leave me to die. You cannot let them take me. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, crossing my hands calmly over my lap. I understand exactly what is going to happen to you, Derek, I replied, my tone clinical and detached. Let us outline your immediate future with absolute clarity so there is no remaining confusion. By this time tomorrow, the federal authorities will formally revoke your temporary bail. The grand jury indictment is already sealed and ready for execution. You will be taken into permanent federal custody, and you will face a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary for massive wire fraud, corporate tax evasion, and criminal forgery. The underground lending syndicate you illegally borrowed from will undoubtedly seize the remaining assets of your fraudulent technology startup. They will realize that you are safely locked away behind federal bars, entirely unreachable. And because they cannot extract their bloody payment from you, they will immediately turn their violent attention toward the only other person intimately connected to your stolen empire. I shifted my gaze downward, locking eyes with Brittany. She shrank back against the heavy wooden leg of the conference table, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. She understood perfectly what I was saying. Her eyes widened round and hollow with the sudden crushing realization of her own impending doom. Your beautiful Bellevue estate is currently in the aggressive stages of immediate foreclosure, I told her, my voice smooth and unrelenting. The bank will officially seize the property by Friday afternoon to recoup the collateral damage of your husband's criminal behavior. You will be formally evicted from the premises by armed sheriffs. Your luxury designer vehicles, the cars you flaunted across your pretentious social media platforms, will be aggressively repossessed before the end of the week. You will be left completely penniless, stripped of the wealth you felt so endlessly entitled to possess. You will be forced to file for absolute humiliating bankruptcy, dragging your pristine social reputation through the mud of public scandal. Brittany shook her head violently from side to side, her hands covering her ears as if she could physically block out the sound of my voice. No, she wailed, a shrill, piercing cry that vibrated against the thick glass windows of the boardroom. No, you cannot do this to us. We are your family. You are supposed to protect us. I will do anything you want. I will be your full-time caregiver. I will make sure you are comfortable. Just please sign the papers and make this nightmare stop. You are not my family, I stated coldly, rising slowly from the leather chair. You are a parasitic infection that I have successfully excised from my life. You treated me like a disposable burden. You laughed at my perceived cognitive decline. You gleefully destroyed the antique silk rug and commanded me to live at a municipal dump. You are now going to experience the exact terrifying vulnerability that you maliciously tried to force upon me. You will spend the rest of your miserable life constantly looking over your shoulder, hiding in cheap, dilapidated motels, terrified that the violent loan sharks your husband defrauded have finally tracked you down. You will live in perpetual fear, and you will do it entirely alone. I turned away from her sobbing, crumbling form and looked at Thomas. The seasoned attorney simply nodded his head in silent, absolute agreement. The legal mechanisms were fully engaged. The trap was irrevocably shut. There was nothing left to discuss, no further negotiations to entertain, and absolutely no mercy left to dispense. I had executed the Alpha Protocol with flawless precision, and the resulting blast radius had effectively vaporized their entire existence. I calmly reached down and buttoned my tailored wool coat. I picked up my leather gloves from the polished surface of the table and slid them onto my hands, adjusting the fabric with meticulous care. Behind me, the sounds of complete psychological devastation filled the room. Derek was screaming my name, a guttural, desperate howl of a man watching the heavy steel doors of a prison cell slam shut forever. Brittany was violently sobbing, beating her fists against the carpet, begging for a salvation that would never, ever arrive. I did not turn back around. I did not offer a single parting glance to the treacherous cowards who had tried to steal my life. I walked purposefully toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room, my footsteps steady and completely silent against the plush flooring. I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the quiet, pristine reception area of the law firm. The chaotic, pathetic screams of my son and his wife instantly muffled behind the thick, soundproof glass. I walked into the waiting private elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing me away from the toxic remnants of my past, I searched my heart for a flicker of paternal guilt. I found absolutely nothing. There was no regret, no lingering sadness, and no painful remorse. There was only a profound, breathtaking sense of liberation. When I stepped onto the busy, rain-slicked streets of downtown Seattle, the crisp air filled my lungs with incredible clarity. I was a man who had engineered absolute justice. I hailed a passing taxi and slowly began my peaceful journey home, knowing the storm was finally completely and permanently over. 3 months have passed since that definitive afternoon in downtown Seattle. I am currently sitting in my small aluminum boat, gently rocking on the calm, dark waters of Lake Washington. The morning air is crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and fresh rain. I have a single fishing line cast into the deep water, but just like before, I do not actually care if I catch anything. The purpose of this journey is simply to enjoy the profound, absolute stillness that now defines my everyday life. The transition from utter chaos to perfect peace was a highly methodical process. Thomas Reynolds executed the final stages of our strategy with surgical precision. The bank auditors fully accepted my official statements, completely validating the undeniable evidence of criminal forgery. My lifetime retirement portfolios, along with the Bellevue estate, were entirely unencumbered and safely returned to my absolute legal control. The massive burden of protecting those assets from my treacherous family has been permanently lifted from my shoulders. I sold the Bellevue property to a corporate developer exactly 30 days after the bank finalized the initial foreclosure proceedings against Derek and Brittany. I had absolutely no desire to return to those manicured lawns or those cold, echoing hallways. That house was a monument to their toxic vanity, a hollow shell where they had paraded their stolen wealth and plotted my psychological destruction. Selling the estate generated a substantial influx of fresh capital, which I immediately diverted into the heavily fortified blind trust. I did not keep that money for my own personal luxury. I realized that my financial legacy needed a new, meaningful direction. Working closely with Thomas Vaughan, established the Martha Caldwell Engineering Scholarship at my late wife's university. The immense endowment is strictly designed to provide full comprehensive tuition for underprivileged students who demonstrate exceptional aptitude but lack the financial resources to pursue their dreams. The very first 3 students received their official acceptance letters just last week. Knowing that Martha's name will continue to foster genuine brilliance and hard work brings a profound warmth to my chest. It is a fitting, beautiful tribute to a woman who always valued absolute integrity over hollow, superficial appearances. I have successfully purchased a comfortable modern condominium overlooking the beautiful Seattle waterfront. It is significantly smaller than the previous estate, but it is infinitely warmer and undeniably secure. My antique drafting tools sit on a solid oak desk directly by the window, and Martha's handmade quilt rests peacefully at the foot of my bed. I am completely surrounded only by the distinct things that carry true, lasting value. The relentless chemical fog that once clouded my mind is entirely gone permanently, replaced by a sharp, unwavering mental clarity. I wake up every single morning without fear, knowing my personal environment is completely safe and my mind is entirely my own. The coffee tastes incredibly rich, and the morning air feels remarkably fresh. The heavy burden of endless deceit has vanished. My life is genuinely good again. As I slowly reel in my dry fishing line and carefully listen to the gentle lapping of the dark water against the aluminum hull, I quietly reflect on the intense path that brought me here today. I survived an intimately orchestrated betrayal by simply refusing to be the compliant victim they desperately required. I stripped away the heavy, suffocating layers of their manipulation and exposed the weak, fragile core of their boundless greed. I cut out the toxicity that was slowly poisoning my existence, and in doing so, I forcefully reclaimed my dignity. Derek and Brittany are facing the severe, unyielding consequences of their actions, while I am finally moving forward with grace. The dark storm has passed, leaving behind a beautifully calm horizon. I am entirely free, and I am perfectly content to spend the rest of my days enjoying this hard-earned peace. Sometimes the deepest form of love you can show your family is allowing them to face the absolute devastation of their own choices. We spend our lives building safety nets for our children, but when they use that net to strangle you, you must have the courage to cut the ropes. Respect is not an inheritance. It is earned. And dignity is not something you surrender simply because the people betraying you happen to share your blood. I had to destroy my own son's world to protect my own soul, and I would do it again without a single regret. Do you think my retaliation was too harsh? Or did they get exactly the justice they deserved? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Tell me what city you are watching from, and hit that subscribe button for more life stories. Stay strong and always demand respect.